A tremendous aura surrounded Rai as he stood silently in the middle of the room, his imposing presence exuding a sense of mystery and power. His gaze lowered, meeting the patient and expectant eyes of his three friends, Shinwoo, Ikhan, and Yuna. The atmosphere was tense but filled with unspoken understanding, as if they were waiting for something monumental to occur. Just an hour earlier, the four of them had been at the local internet cafe, seated together in the bustling speed PC room. The air was filled with the constant hum of powerful CPUs and the rhythmic clicking of mice and keyboards, creating a lively backdrop for their gaming session. Shinwoo, Ikhan, and Yuna had turned on their computers immediately, eager to dive into the competitive world of their favorite online game. Rai, however, had simply sat quietly, his computer untouched, as though the act of joining them was an alien concept. Yuna, noticing his stillness, had asked why Rai wasn't playing, only to discover that he had merely observed during their last visit as well. This revelation spurred Ikhan into action, insisting that Rai could no longer remain a passive spectator. With a mix of determination and encouragement, he took it upon himself to guide Rai through the basics of gaming. Turning on Rai's computer, Ikhan began showing him the ropes, positioning Rai's fingers on the keyboard and mouse, and explaining how to navigate the virtual world. He demonstrated how to move using the keyboard, adjust the view with the mouse, and attack by aiming and clicking. Shinwoo, never one to miss an opportunity to tease, chimed in from his seat, offering playful comments about how natural Rai looked in position, though his mischievous grin hinted at the antics to come. Despite the seemingly lighthearted atmosphere, it was clear to everyone that Rai was entirely new to this and would require some patience and practice. Once the game began, however, Shinwoo's competitive nature quickly overtook his initial intention to help. Instead of offering genuine guidance, he treated the game as an opportunity to show off his skills, sneaking up on Rai's character and effortlessly eliminating him. Shinwoo's laughter filled the room as he playfully mocked Rai's lack of experience, his confidence bordering on arrogance. Yuna and Ikhan, though initially amused, soon grew frustrated with Shinwoo's behavior, realizing that his actions were more discouraging than instructive. They scolded him for his lack of consideration, pointing out that Rai was completely unfamiliar with the game and needed a more supportive approach. Shinwoo, however, couldn't seem to resist the urge to taunt, even attempting to play one-handed to further emphasize the skill gap. His antics continued to frustrate Yuna and Ikhan, who exchanged exasperated glances, silently debating how best to handle the situation. Eventually, Ikhan suggested that Yuna, being new to the game herself, should play against Rai in a one-on-one match. This way, the two beginners could learn together without the added pressure of Shinwoo's relentless teasing. Yuna readily agreed, offering Rai an encouraging smile as she prepared for their match. Ikhan, ever the perfectionist, stepped in to give Yuna a brief tutorial, ensuring she understood the basics before the game started. As the match began, it quickly became apparent that Rai's struggles extended beyond mere inexperience. Despite his best efforts, he couldn't manage to win a single round, and Yuna, who had just learned the controls, consistently outplayed him. Each time Rai's character was eliminated, Shinwoo couldn't help but burst into laughter, finding the situation endlessly entertaining. He made light of Rai's repeated defeats, joking about his inability to even land a hit on Yuna. Ikhan, attempting to defend Rai, reminded Shinwoo that not everyone was naturally skilled at video games, but even he couldn't hide his amusement at Rai's performance. Yuna, while grateful for the praise she received for her unexpected success, felt a pang of sympathy for Rai, who seemed increasingly disheartened with each loss. The three friends whispered among themselves, their voices carrying a mix of humor and concern as they discussed Rai's evident lack of skill. They joked that even if they tried, they couldn't play as poorly as Rai had, but their laughter was tempered by a growing sense of guilt. Despite their lighthearted teasing, they acknowledged the awkwardness of the situation and debated whether they should go easier on him. For Rai, the experience was a mix of frustration and determination. The repeated defeats weighed on him, but he refused to let the ridicule affect him outwardly. His quiet resolve was evident in the way he continued to play, silently absorbing the mechanics of the game and focusing on improving. Though the others didn't fully realize it, Rai's composed demeanor masked an intense determination to rise above the challenge. As the session progressed, the tension in the room shifted, and the friends gradually grew quieter, their initial amusement giving way to a deeper curiosity about Rai's potential. They couldn't help but wonder if, beneath his quiet exterior, Rai was preparing to surprise them all. The day was still bright as the group left the internet cafe and strolled along the bustling road, their conversations blending with the noise of traffic. Shinwoo, as usual, was animated, laughing loudly and relishing the memory of their gaming session. For him, it had been a welcome escape, a perfect stress reliever. While he boasted about how his gaming losses from Ik-han last time had been thoroughly avenged, Ik-han attempted to comfort Rai, whose performance during the session had been lackluster at best. Despite his reassurances, Shinwoo couldn't resist pointing out how well Yuna had performed, praising her for her flawless victories over Rai. The comments, though lighthearted, made Rai fall silent as he walked a few steps behind, absorbed in his thoughts. Yuna, on the other hand, remained composed, quietly nodding at Shinwoo's compliments. Her reserved demeanor contrasted sharply with Shinwoo's exuberance, while Ik-han sighed in mild exasperation, trying to keep the conversation from veering further into teasing. As they continued down the street, the lively mood was interrupted when the group noticed two strange men standing ahead on the sidewalk. Both men were clad in dark trench coats, their figures striking against the midday brightness. One of them, a tall and muscular figure with an imposing presence, stood with arms crossed, while the other, leaner and marked by a scar that ran across his lips, seemed more relaxed but equally menacing. Their eyes were fixed intently on the group, observing them with a strange, unsettling focus. The group slowed their pace momentarily, the tension palpable among them. Ik-han couldn't shake the unease he felt, and even Shinwoo, usually brash and confident, fell uncharacteristically quiet as they approached the pair. The men exuded an aura that was hard to ignore, their piercing gazes causing an involuntary chill to run down the spines of the four friends. Despite the intimidation, the group continued walking, choosing not to stop or acknowledge the men. Yet, as they passed by, the two strangers seemed to become increasingly fixated on Rai, their expressions shifting from curiosity to something more wary, as if they sensed an unfamiliar, almost threatening presence radiating from him. Shinwoo, casting a brief glance back at the men, recognized a certain familiarity in their appearance but couldn't immediately place it. Meanwhile, the men exchanged a glance of their own, their thoughts racing. To have been noticed so quickly by the boy in red, Shinwoo, was unexpected. They were especially wary of how his awareness of them seemed almost deliberate, as though he had sensed their presence long before the group reached them. After creating some distance between themselves and the two men, Shinwoo broke the silence, remarking on the uncanny resemblance of the larger man to their homeroom teacher. While he spoke in his usual lighthearted tone, Ik-han nervously hushed him, worried that the strangers might overhear. Still, Shinwoo couldn't help but comment further, pointing out the rarity of such a massive build. Ik-han's attempts to quiet him were half-hearted at best, and Yuna walked silently beside them, her eyes darting back momentarily toward the men before she focused on her steps. Behind them, the tension between the two trench-coated figures deepened. The scarred man muttered impatiently about the absence of another accomplice, a recently turned vampire they had ordered to meet them. The larger man, visibly agitated, clenched his jaw and cursed under his breath, his towering figure emanating frustration. Their annoyance only grew as they realized that their underling had yet to surface, despite explicit instructions. Meanwhile, beneath the streets in the dark, damp confines of the sewer, the vampire man they had referred to paced restlessly. He growled under his breath, torn between obeying the orders of his superiors and the inevitable risk of stepping out into the daylight. The sun's rays, still strong in the early afternoon, posed a lethal threat to him, and he hesitated, his instincts urging him to stay hidden. Unaware of the brewing tension behind them, the group of friends began discussing lunch. Shinwoo, ever the instigator of plans, proposed grabbing burgers, a suggestion that was quickly met with agreement from the others. The thought of food lightened their mood as they walked further away from the strange men. Yet, the unsettling feeling from their brief encounter lingered, faint but persistent, as if the gaze of the two men still followed them. The trench-coated men, on the other hand, remained rooted in place. The scarred man tilted his head back, glancing at the clear sky and the sun shining brightly above. With a faint smirk, he muttered something about the weather, as though mocking the inconvenience the daylight presented to their plans. Meanwhile, below ground, their accomplice continued pacing, his frustration mounting as he contemplated his next move. The tension between them all, on the surface and beneath it, hung in the air, heavy with the promise of something yet to unfold. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the dark sky glittered with stars, the vampire man finally emerged from his hiding place in the sewer. The streets, now cloaked in shadow, were quiet and still, with most of the city's inhabitants already asleep. The windows of the houses were dark, their lights extinguished for the night. The vampire man climbed out of the sewer, his movements deliberate and predatory. Standing under the night sky, he looked up at the glowing moon, its pale light casting a cold sheen on his figure. A low, guttural growl escaped his throat, as though expressing his pent-up frustration and hunger. Nearby, the two men who had turned him into a vampire stood waiting, their trench coats billowing slightly in the cool night breeze. They watched him with disdain, unimpressed by his late appearance. One of them sneered, his voice dripping with contempt as he made a mocking remark about the vampire man's delayed arrival and futile attempt to appear intimidating. The vampire man, sensing their derision, scratched his head in an awkward display of embarrassment, unable to meet their eyes. The taller of the two men shook his head in frustration, muttering about the vampire man's incompetence. Their patience had clearly worn thin. Despite their irritation, the scarred man revealed a piece of crucial information they had uncovered during the vampire man's absence. With a cold and calculating tone, he shared that they had found the address of one of the children, the one the vampire man would undoubtedly want to target the most. The vampire man's eyes gleamed with excitement at this revelation, a grin spreading across his face to reveal his sharp teeth. However, their generosity came with a warning. The taller man made it clear that while they had provided him with a lead, the rest of the task was his responsibility. He was to find the other children on his own and eliminate them without fail. The tone of the man's voice grew darker as he issued a final threat, promising to end the vampire man's miserable existence if he failed to deliver results. The air around them grew heavy with tension as the vampire man nodded silently, his resolve hardening under the weight of their ultimatum. Meanwhile, in the chairman's home, Rai sat in the comfort of the TV lounge, sipping tea from a cup. The atmosphere inside was calm and refined, a stark contrast to the turmoil brewing outside. Frankenstein, the chairman, stood nearby, his expression serious as he shared his thoughts on a recent homicide. He suspected that the murderer was the very man Rai and the children had encountered earlier. His sources had reported that the victim's corpse had been drained of nearly all its blood, a clear sign of vampiric activity. The scene of the crime was not far from where Rai and the others had met the trench-coated men, and with no other known supernatural creatures in the vicinity, it seemed highly likely that one of those men was responsible for the grisly act. To confirm his suspicions, Frankenstein had ordered the corpse to be monitored, but it showed no signs of transformation or abnormality, further solidifying his theory. As Frankenstein shared his findings, Rai remained composed, his gaze steady and contemplative. After a moment, he quietly spoke, revealing something that startled Frankenstein. Rai mentioned that he had experienced death earlier that day. Frankenstein froze, his eyes widening in shock and disbelief. The idea of his master, someone so powerful and seemingly invincible, claiming to have faced death was almost incomprehensible. Struggling to process the statement, he asked for clarification. Rai's response, however, was unexpected. He described being taken to a dark and unfamiliar place, one that he referred to as an internet cafe. Frankenstein's confusion deepened as he tried to grasp the connection. Slowly, he began to realize that Rai was not speaking of a literal death, but rather his experience playing games at the cafe. Rai continued, his voice calm yet filled with an uncharacteristic vulnerability, describing the feeling of powerlessness he had encountered during the games. He spoke of being ruthlessly defeated, his entire being overwhelmed by the experience. Frankenstein, now understanding the context, felt a mix of relief and awkwardness. He struggled to suppress a smile, realizing that Rai was earnestly recounting his first experience with video games. As Rai expressed his dismay at being killed so thoroughly, Frankenstein's mind raced, wondering how to console him without offending his pride. He sweated nervously, unsure whether to acknowledge the gravity with which Rai described the situation or to gently explain the true nature of the games. The contrast between Rai's solemn recounting and the mundane reality of his death left Frankenstein in an unusual predicament, his composure as a loyal servant tested by the absurdity of the moment. Beneath the dark, starry sky, the two men stood together, their postures relaxed but their words sharp and dripping with malice. The one with a scar spoke first, his tone tinged with amusement as he commented on the surprising creativity of the vampire man, someone they had long considered useless. He admitted that while it might take some time, the plan the vampire man had set into motion promised to be entertaining. The tall man beside him nodded in agreement, noting the particular kind of dread that arises when someone with a personal grudge comes to confront you in your own home. Their conversation lingered on the child they were targeting, speculating about his growing sense of unease. The scarred man remarked that the child likely sensed something unusual about the vampire man during their first encounter, a suspicion likely reinforced by the noise the humans were making about the vampire's hunting activities. With these circumstances, the scarred man was convinced that the child had already connected the dots and identified the vampire man as the killer. They both chuckled darkly, finding pleasure in imagining the boy's current state of fear and helplessness. Their laughter echoed under the stars, features, accompanied by their sinister grins, exposing sharp teeth that gleamed faintly in the dim light. Nearby, the vampire man himself sat brooding, his excitement simmering beneath the surface. He relished the thought of tormenting his target, his mind teeming with plans for the suffering he would inflict. His words, whispered into the night, carried a promise of pain and terror. He would make sure his victim endured a slow, agonizing death. His laugh, raw and malevolent, reverberated through the stillness of the night as he prepared to take the next step in his twisted game. When the sun rose and another day began, life returned to its normal rhythm at school. Inside the classroom, Shinwoo, Ikhan, Yuna, and Rai gathered around a table, staring at a school bag placed on its surface. It was a familiar sight, and Shinwoo's heart raced as he identified it as the very bag he had lost during their terrifying encounter with the vampire man. The room buzzed with tension as the group tried to make sense of its sudden reappearance. Shinwoo recounted his experience that morning, explaining how he had found the bag on his doorstep just as he was leaving for school. His initial relief at recovering it had quickly given way to unease as he remembered the circumstances under which he had lost it. That morning, as Shinwoo had opened the front door of his apartment, still yawning and trying to shake off sleep, his gaze had fallen to the ground. There, sitting just outside his door, was the bag he had thought he would never see again. For a moment, he had been frozen in shock, unable to believe his eyes. Then, with growing excitement, he had picked it up, marveling at how all his belongings were still inside. The scratch marks on its surface confirmed that it was indeed his, but the strange circumstances of its return left a lingering sense of dread. Back in the classroom, he confidently declared it to be his, despite Ikhan's doubts. Even as he rummaged through the bag to prove his claim, his mind wandered to what could have possibly happened. But there was one thing missing, something Shinwoo couldn't quite shake from his thoughts. Crossing his arms, he fell silent, his thoughts consumed by the mystery. Elsewhere, beneath the city in the damp, foul-smelling sewers, the vampire man sat alone, surrounded by darkness. Beside him lay one of Shinwoo's books, its title, Don't Do This, seeming almost ironic given the events unfolding. The vampire's long fingers traced the cover absent-mindedly, but his mind was focused on his plan. He spoke into the silence, his voice filled with venom and determination. He envisioned the terror he would inflict, the fear that would consume his prey. The image of his victim suffocating on his own dread brought a twisted smile to his face. The vampire laughed again, a cruel sound that echoed through the tunnels, blending with the dripping water and the scurrying of unseen rats. The game had begun, and he was determined to ensure it ended on his terms, with his victim crushed under the weight of pure, unrelenting fear. Shinwoo giggled with relief as he held his recently recovered school bag, unaware of the growing tension among his friends. Ikhan, standing nearby, observed him quietly, his sharp mind piecing together the unsettling details of the situation. Something felt off, a nagging sense of unease he couldn't shake. As he mulled over the events, he thought back to the day Shinwoo had lost the bag. It had been during Yuna's frightening encounter with the strange, dangerous man. The sequence of events replayed vividly in his mind. Shinwoo had reacted to Yuna's scream, abandoning his bag in the process. Ikhan had retrieved it while following him but had been forced to leave it behind when the group fled for their lives. Days later, the bag mysteriously reappeared, sitting neatly on Shinwoo's doorstep. The circumstances surrounding its return were deeply troubling. Someone had clearly delivered it, but the real question was how they had identified Shinwoo as the owner and, more disturbingly, discovered where he lived. The implications of this were too grave to ignore. Ikhan, always the voice of reason, concluded that they needed to involve the chairman. The others agreed, their unease spreading as they considered the implications of the situation. Later, in the chairman's office, the group relayed the details of the mysterious incident. The chairman listened intently, his hands clasped together as he processed the information. His expression betrayed his concern, though his composed demeanor offered the group some reassurance. Internally, however, the chairman's thoughts raced. He saw the return of the bag not as a harmless act but as the prelude to something far more sinister. This was not a simple warning, it was the deliberate initiation of a hunt, a cruel game meant to instill terror in the prey before the predator struck. The fact that the vampire man had failed during his first attempt and left witnesses only heightened the chairman's fears. This was no accident, there was intent behind every action. The vampire would not simply walk away, he would escalate, and the chairman knew that the danger to Shinwoo and the others had only just begun. Turning his attention back to the group, the chairman addressed Shinwoo directly, asking if he lived alone since his father was abroad. When Shinwoo confirmed, the chairman immediately suggested that he avoid returning home for the time being. Shinwoo agreed without hesitation, deciding to stay at Ikhan's house temporarily. The group raised the idea of involving the police, but the chairman dismissed the notion with pragmatism. While the police could take their testimonies, they would likely dismiss the incident as minor, especially given that it revolved around a recovered bag. The level of protection needed to keep the group safe was far beyond what the police could offer. The chairman assured them, however, that he would leverage his personal connections to inform the authorities discreetly, though he knew in his heart that this was merely a gesture to calm the students. Ordinary police intervention would be futile against the threat they faced. The chairman's mind turned to the broader implications of the hunt. The students had been marked as prey, and the time had come for him to step in directly. He could no longer afford to remain passive. That night, under the cover of darkness, the city streets lay eerily silent, illuminated only by the faint glow of the stars. Outside Shinwoo's apartment, the air grew thick with a sinister presence. A figure loomed in the shadows near the door, his growls and labored breaths breaking the stillness. The figure, a vampire, radiated menace as he waited, his crimson eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. His sharp features and fangs glinted as his chest heaved with anticipation. A security guard patrolling the area climbed the stairs, his flashlight slicing through the darkness. Spotting the man, he hesitated, sensing something unnatural. Calling out, the guard demanded to know who the intruder was. But the vampire's only response was to turn slowly, baring his teeth in an expression of raw fury. The guard, though afraid, tried to confront him, questioning his presence. The vampire's patience snapped. In a flash, he lunged forward, gripping the guard by the neck with inhuman strength and hoisting him into the air as though he weighed nothing. The guard struggled desperately, his feet kicking against empty space as the flashlight fell from his grasp. The light flickered, casting grotesque shadows on the wall as the vampire tightened his grip. Without hesitation, the vampire sank his fangs into the guard's neck, the sickening sound of flesh tearing echoing through the empty hall. The guard twitched violently, his body convulsing as blood spilled freely from the wound, pooling on the ground in a dark, glistening puddle. The vampire, unmoved by the man's final, feeble attempts to resist, fed with a savage hunger. The scene was gruesome, a chilling display of the vampire's power and ruthlessness, a harbinger of the terror that was yet to come. As the sun began its descent, painting the sky in hues of purple and pink, two figures clad in long trench coats stood atop a towering building. The man with a scar etched across his face gazed down at the city below, a smirk playing on his lips as he observed the world of mortals bustling beneath them. His companion, a tall and imposing figure, stood silently beside him, his sharp eyes scanning the horizon. The scarred man mused on their quarry, remarking on the boy's decision to avoid his home. It was a calculated move born of fear, and that fear, he noted with twisted delight, made the game all the more exhilarating. For them, this was no mere hunt, it was a carefully orchestrated game of cat and mouse, where the prey's terror only served to heighten the thrill. The tall man, however, brought up the recent murder. The vampire's victim had not been their intended target but a security guard who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. The taller man expressed his concern that the discovery of the body would stir unwanted attention and make things messier. Yet, the scarred man dismissed the worry with ease, confident that the vampire's bloodlust would soon resurface, drawing them closer to their ultimate goal. He chuckled darkly, mentioning that they would now shift their focus to the other children. The hunt, after all, was far from over. For them, the children were nothing more than pawns in a deadly game, their suffering a source of entertainment. Elsewhere, Rai sat in quiet contemplation, flipping through the pages of a booklet that Frankenstein had prepared for him. The booklet, though outwardly trivial in its title, served as a symbol of the care and devotion Frankenstein had shown during his long years of searching. As Rai read, Frankenstein approached, breaking the stillness with grim news. The security guard from Shinwoo's apartment complex had gone missing the night before. Though the body had yet to be recovered, the blood left behind was evidence enough of a violent end. Frankenstein theorized that the vampire, likely in search of Shinwoo, had been interrupted by the guard and had killed him to cover his tracks. The gravity of the situation was undeniable. Shinwoo and his friends were now being deliberately targeted, their lives in imminent danger. Frankenstein's voice carried the weight of his concern as he acknowledged that the hunt showed no signs of ceasing. The predators, emboldened by their thirst for fear and blood, were relentless. Meanwhile, Yuna was unaware of the peril creeping ever closer. In the quiet of the early evening, she stood in her kitchen, rummaging through the fridge for a drink. Realizing she had run out of juice, she glanced out the window to check the fading sunlight. Despite Shinwoo and Nick Han's insistence that she remain home, Yuna reasoned that a quick trip to the convenience store would be harmless. The streets were still lively, filled with people, and the hour was early. Reassured by the normalcy of the scene outside, she ventured out, unaware of the danger that shadowed her steps. As she walked home, clutching the bag of groceries, two figures in trench coats silently trailed her, their movements deliberate and calculated. They followed her every step, their presence cloaked in the indifference of the bustling city. Yuna's obliviousness to their gaze only deepened the sense of unease that hung in the air. Back at Frankenstein's residence, the air was heavy with a different tension. Sitting in the dimly lit lounge, Frankenstein spoke with quiet resolve, reflecting on the years he had spent searching for Rai. After Rai's disappearance, Frankenstein had taken every precaution to remain hidden, avoiding discovery while tirelessly seeking his master's whereabouts. Even now, with Rai's return, the necessity of maintaining secrecy had not diminished. Their enemies were still out there, their intentions unknown, and the danger had only grown more pronounced with the children's lives now at stake. Frankenstein's loyalty was evident in his every word, his dedication unwavering as he resolved to protect his master and those under his care. Rai, ever composed, acknowledged the need for caution but made it clear that action was inevitable. The targeting of the children could not go unanswered. Placing the booklet gently on the coffee table, Rai silently reaffirmed his commitment to confronting the dangers that threatened their fragile peace. The booklet's title, a lighthearted jest from Frankenstein, stood in stark contrast to the dark realities unfolding around them, a reminder of the moments of levity that still lingered amidst the looming shadows. Late at night, while most of the city slept under a blanket of silence, Shinwoo was lounging on the couch at Ik-han's apartment, the faint glow of the TV illuminating the room. He aimlessly flipped through the channels, letting out a deep yawn that hinted at his restlessness. His stomach grumbled, a sign of his perpetual hunger, though he had recently eaten. Meanwhile, Ik-han moved about the small apartment, barely paying attention to Shinwoo's idle complaints. The TV remote beeped as Shinwoo switched channels, eventually pausing on a news broadcast. The headline immediately caught their attention, snapping them out of their relaxed state. The report detailed the mysterious disappearance of a security guard, Mr. Lee, from the apartment complex in the same district where Shinwoo lived. The anchor described the chilling discovery of blood on the emergency staircase, leading authorities to suspect foul play. The weight of the news struck both boys, their casual demeanor shifting to one of unease. Ik-han was the first to connect the dots, recalling the strange event from the previous night when someone had left Shinwoo's bag at his house. A creeping suspicion took root in his mind, and before he could voice his thoughts fully, Shinwoo decided to call Yuna, concern for her safety overriding everything else. His heart pounded as the phone rang endlessly, the seconds feeling like hours. Relief seemed near when the call was answered, but the voice that greeted him wasn't Yuna's. It was a man's voice, calm, calculating, and sinister. The man on the other end knew Shinwoo's name, addressing him as though they were old acquaintances. The realization hit Shinwoo like a punch to the gut. This was no coincidence. His name, his voice, his identity, it had all been deliberately sought out. The man's taunting words confirmed Shinwoo's fears as he casually mentioned recognizing him, thanking him for making things so easy. Shinwoo's breath caught in his chest as the man continued speaking, his tone dripping with malice. The stranger's words hinted at a cruel game in progress, one where Yuna's life hung precariously in the balance. Shinwoo demanded answers, but his questions were met with cryptic replies that only heightened his panic. The man revealed that Yuna was alive, though his emphasis on "for now" left little room for comfort. He dismissed Shinwoo's anger with an air of mockery, presenting an opportunity for Shinwoo to prove his worth. The suggestion was laced with derision, a reminder of a past incident where Shinwoo had intervened heroically. The man seemed to relish the psychological torment he was inflicting, warning Shinwoo against involving the police, knowing full well that such an action would seal Yuna's fate. His chilling laughter echoed in Shinwoo's ears long after the call ended. Fueled by desperation and rage, Shinwoo bolted toward the front door, throwing it open with such force that it rattled on its hinges. Ik-han called after him, panic evident in his voice as he urged Shinwoo to reconsider. But Shinwoo, consumed by the need to save Yuna, refused to listen. He pointed out the obvious: the man's threat was real, and the bloodied news report only reinforced the gravity of the situation. Ik-han stood frozen for a moment, torn between fear and the need to act. The chairman's instructions echoed in his mind, urging him to call for help if anything went wrong. Trembling, Ik-han pulled out his phone and quickly dialed the chairman's number, his fingers shaking as he recounted the events that had unfolded. On the other end of the line, the chairman listened intently, his expression darkening with every word. Seated beside him, Rai absorbed the information in his usual quiet, stoic manner. The two exchanged a knowing look, their shared understanding of the danger fueling an unspoken resolve. Together, they began to devise a strategy, aware that time was slipping through their fingers and that every second mattered. On a dark and ominous night, under a sky faintly illuminated by shimmering stars, a half-constructed building stood as the perfect hiding place for the men who had kidnapped Yuna. The skeletal structure, with its exposed beams and unfinished walls, loomed against the night like a shadowy specter. Inside, the air was damp and heavy with the scent of concrete and steel. The dim glow of a single flickering bulb, hastily rigged for light, cast long, eerie shadows that danced across the cold surfaces. In one corner of the desolate site, Yuna sat huddled, her small frame trembling as fear coursed through her veins. Her wide, tear-filled eyes darted around, searching for answers in the surrounding darkness. Her mind was in turmoil, replaying the events that had brought her to this terrifying place. It had only been 2 hours ago when she was walking home from the convenience store, a juice box clutched in her hand. The soft sound of her sneakers padding against the pavement breaking the silence of the empty street. She remembered the sudden call of a man's voice behind her, startling her into turning around. As her gaze landed on him, she felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The tall man's large, white eyes seemed to pierce into her soul, drawing her into their unnatural depths. Before she could even process what was happening, a wave of dizziness overtook her, and her body crumpled to the ground. The juice box slipped from her fingers, its contents spilling out onto the pavement, a stark symbol of her vulnerability. That was the last thing she remembered before waking up in this strange, incomplete building. Now, sitting in the corner, her back pressed against the rough, cold wall, Yuna's heart raced. Her thoughts were muddled with confusion and fear. Why had she lost consciousness so suddenly? Why had these men brought her here? She barely had time to collect herself before the sound of heavy footsteps approached. 2 figures emerged from the shadows, one tall and broad, his massive build almost inhuman, and the other wiry, with a long scar etched across his lips that twisted his expression into something sinister. Yuna instinctively flinched as they stepped closer, their presence oppressive and threatening. Her voice trembled as she tried to speak, but before she could finish her plea, the scarred man's sharp, commanding tone cut through the air, silencing her and sending a fresh wave of fear crashing over her. Her lips quivered, and tears welled in her eyes as she pressed herself tighter into the corner. The scarred man's gaze lingered on her, his expression cold and calculating, while his larger companion shifted his attention to something outside. "They're here," the bigger man growled, his deep voice resonating through the empty space. Yuna's heart leaped as the meaning of his words sank in. The faint sound of hurried footsteps echoed from below, growing louder with each passing second. Within moments, Shinwoo and Ikhan burst into the building, their breathing heavy and their faces flushed with determination. They skidded to a stop as they spotted Yuna and the 2 kidnappers, their eyes narrowing with rage and resolve. Shinwoo's gaze immediately locked onto Yuna, who looked back at him with tear-streaked cheeks and a mixture of relief and fear. She managed to whisper his name, her voice shaky and weak, but it was enough to ignite the fire in Shinwoo's heart. He had no intention of leaving without her, no matter the cost. The scarred man smirked, clearly unfazed by their sudden arrival. He studied them with a calculating eye, as though assessing their strength and resolve. There was an unsettling confidence in his posture, a predator sizing up his prey. He taunted them, pointing out how quickly they had arrived, indicating that Shinwoo's immediate, reckless reaction to the phone call had played directly into his hands. Despite the man's calm demeanor, Shinwoo's eyes burned with unrelenting fury. The thought of anyone harming his friends filled him with a rage he could barely contain. His fists clenched at his sides, his body taut with adrenaline, as he locked eyes with the scarred man. He had no interest in words or games. His only focus was on protecting Yuna and ensuring these men paid for what they had done. Ikhan, though less outwardly aggressive, was equally determined. He stood slightly behind Shinwoo, his fists balled and his mind racing. The 2 boys were just high school students, but the weight of their resolve and the depth of their loyalty to their friend made them formidable in their own right. Despite the odds stacked against them, they refused to back down. The scarred man, sensing the tension in the air, straightened his posture and gestured toward the boys with a mocking smile. His companion, the massive man with an imposing frame, cracked his knuckles and took a step forward, his presence alone enough to make the ground seem to tremble. The stage was set, the lines drawn. 2 high school boys stood against 2 dangerous, seasoned criminals, and the air in the half-finished building seemed to thicken with the weight of what was about to unfold. Shinwoo's eyes narrowed as he took in the sight of the 2 men before him, their presence immediately triggering a sense of recognition. The scarred man with a twisted smirk and his hulking companion, These were the same figures he had noticed on the street just days before. A strange unease had settled in his gut then, an instinct that told him something about them wasn't right. Now, standing before them in the eerie half-constructed building, he realized just how right he had been. His mind raced as he recalled the details of that fleeting encounter, piecing together fragments of suspicion and fear. He had assumed the man who attacked Yuna was someone else entirely, yet here they stood, orchestrating something sinister. His gaze flickered toward Yuna, searching for signs of injury, and a slight wave of relief washed over him when he saw that she appeared unharmed. But that relief was short-lived, quickly replaced by the tension in the air. His thoughts were interrupted as the scarred man spoke, his tone laced with amusement, as if enjoying the confusion and fear radiating from his captives. There was a mocking edge to his voice, a confidence that suggested he had already accounted for every possible outcome. Before Shinwoo could react, a dark silhouette emerged from behind the scarred man, stepping forward with an unsettling grace. The room's dim lighting barely concealed the unnerving features of the approaching figure. Yuna, Ikhan, and Shinwoo's eyes widened in shock as they recognized him instantly, the very man who had attacked Yuna that night. The revelation sent their hearts pounding in their chests, fear clawing at their senses as the weight of the situation fully settled over them. Shinwoo's breath hitched as he processed the sight before him. His worst suspicions had been confirmed. This was no ordinary criminal. It was the same monstrous entity that had assaulted Yuna in the dark, the predator lurking in the night. His thoughts sharpened, his instincts screaming danger. There was no doubt in his mind now, this was an execution, a test designed to eliminate them as witnesses. The vampire-like figure growled, his sharp fangs glinting menacingly as he took a slow, deliberate step forward. Every movement was unnatural, exuding a primal hunger that sent chills down their spines. The scarred man's voice broke through the tense silence once more, his words calculated and precise. This meeting, he explained, had been arranged with a specific purpose, to present them with a so-called offer. The weight of those words hung heavily in the air. An offer. Shinwoo's fists clenched as he processed the absurdity of it. There was no kindness in this proposition. No mercy in the tone of the scarred man's voice. It was a challenge wrapped in false generosity, a game of survival where the odds were stacked against them. Ikhan, standing rigid beside him, hesitated before voicing the question lingering in both their minds. How could they possibly trust these men? A wicked grin spread across the faces of the two kidnappers, their expressions dripping with amusement at the idea of their prey questioning them. They didn't need to offer reassurance, their power was already evident in the situation they had created. They had orchestrated every moment leading up to this, and the control was entirely in their hands. The scarred man's next words sent an icy shiver through them. There was no room for negotiation, no alternative path. Either they accepted the challenge and fought for their lives, or they perished. The sheer weight of that statement settled over Shinwoo and Ikhan like an iron chain, suffocating and unrelenting. Their blood ran cold, and for a brief moment, fear threatened to paralyze them. The vampire man's presence loomed closer, his long face eerily pale, his red eyes gleaming with the promise of violence. His razor-sharp nails twitched in anticipation, his entire body coiled like a predator ready to pounce. Shinwoo exhaled sharply, forcing himself to push past the terror gripping his chest. His fear was real, but he couldn't afford to let it control him. He squared his shoulders, his hands tightening into fists. The scarred man's expression shifted ever so slightly as he observed the resolve hardening in Shinwoo's gaze. There was no hesitation left now. If this was their only option, then he would face it head-on. His stance changed, his feet planting firmly against the ground as he adjusted into a boxing position, his muscles tense and prepared for impact. The vampire creature let out a low, guttural growl before lunging forward with inhuman speed. And in that split second, Shinwoo steeled himself for the fight that would determine their fate. Shinwoo wasted no time as he charged forward, his body fueled by adrenaline and the unwavering determination to protect his friends. With precise movements, he lunged at the vampire-like figure, unleashing a relentless barrage of punches from every direction. His fists struck with force, landing solid hits that sent ripples of impact through his opponent's body. He did not let up, continuing his fierce assault until he noticed blood dripping from the creature's mouth, a sign that his attacks were taking effect. Without hesitation, he sprang into the air, twisting his body mid-motion and launching a powerful kick directly at the vampire's face. The impact was explosive, sending the monstrous figure flying backward. The force of the kick propelled him across the room, and with a loud crash, he collided against a half-constructed wall, leaving a dent in the already unstable structure. A brief moment of stunned silence followed as Shinwoo's companions, Ikhan and Yuna, watched in awe. Their eyes widened in shock and admiration at the sheer skill and power displayed before them. Even the two men orchestrating this sinister encounter seemed momentarily taken aback, their expressions betraying a flicker of surprise at Shinwu's unexpected strength. He had left quite an impression on them, proving himself to be more formidable than they had anticipated. Panting slightly, Shinwu bent forward, hands resting on his knees as he exhaled sharply. A grin spread across his face, wide and triumphant. His confidence soared as he took a moment to revel in his apparent victory. He had landed every blow with precision, feeling the solid resistance of his fists against his opponent's body. Surely, he had done enough damage to incapacitate him. But before the sense of accomplishment could fully settle, an unsettling movement caught his attention. The vampire man, against all logic, began to stir. Slowly but surely, he pulled himself up, rising to his feet as if the brutal attack he had just endured had been nothing more than a minor inconvenience. Ikhan's voice faltered in disbelief as he attempted to warn Shinwu, but the sight alone was enough for Shinwu to understand the gravity of the situation. His fists clenched, the grin on his face fading as confusion and frustration took hold. He had landed every hit perfectly, yet the man stood as though nothing had happened. How was this possible? No ordinary human could withstand such an onslaught and recover so quickly. His mind raced, trying to rationalize what he was witnessing. Was this man truly human? Or had they been thrown into a battle against something far beyond their understanding? Shinwu's instincts kicked in once more. He could not afford to hesitate. If his opponent would not go down easily, then he would simply have to try harder. Shaking off the growing unease creeping up his spine, he rolled his shoulders, warming up his hands for the next round of attacks. His stance remained strong, his determination unwavering. With renewed vigor, he launched himself forward once more, aiming to finish what he had started. His fists blurred as he struck again and again, each punch fueled by desperation and sheer willpower. The vampire man showed no reaction at first, but Shinwu refused to stop. He pressed on, driving his knuckles into his opponent's stomach with all the strength he could muster. Then, in a sudden and unexpected shift, the vampire man caught Shinwu's fist mid-strike. His grip was like steel, unyielding and suffocating. Shinwu barely had time to react before the creature tightened his hold, attempting to lift him off the ground with terrifying ease. Acting on instinct, Shinwu retaliated, delivering a swift and brutal punch to the side of the vampire's temple. The impact should have been enough to knock out any normal opponent, yet instead of collapsing, the vampire retaliated with inhuman speed. His glowing red eyes burned with newfound intensity as he lashed out, throwing a counterattack that Shinwu barely managed to evade. Despite his quick reflexes, the creature's claws still grazed his cheek, leaving a sharp sting in their wake. Shinwu's mind reeled as he struggled to comprehend the situation. His attacks, each carefully executed, each meant to incapacitate, were having no effect. The realization dawned upon him with chilling clarity. His opponent was no ordinary being. The unnatural resilience, the eerie recovery, the monstrous presence, this was no human at all. His chest tightened as his initial confidence wavered, replaced by a growing sense of unease. He had faced strong fighters before, but never anything like this. His heart pounded as he forced himself to remain calm, knowing that panic would only make things worse. Whatever this thing was, he would have to find a way to defeat it, no matter how impossible the odds seemed. Meanwhile, unbeknownst to Shinwu and his friends, two figures approached the half-constructed building from the shadows. Rai and Frankenstein, with an air of quiet authority, walked toward the unfolding chaos, their expressions unreadable. They had been drawn to this place by a sense of foreboding, a dark presence that threatened to spiral out of control. Their arrival was not a moment too soon, for the battle within the building was far from over, and Shinwu had yet to realize the full extent of the danger he was up against. Shinwu struggled against the vampire man's iron grip, his fingers curling into a fist as he realized the terrifying reality of his situation. No matter how hard he struck, no matter how precise his attacks were, they had no effect on this monstrous being. It was as if the creature felt no pain, no resistance, nothing. His mind raced, desperate to formulate a new strategy. If direct attacks weren't working, perhaps restricting his opponent's movement would give him an advantage. With swift reflexes and a determined glare, Shinwu shifted his position, twisting the vampire's arm behind his back in a quick, forceful motion. A sickening crack filled the air as he exerted all his strength, crushing the bones inside. For a brief moment, a flicker of pain flashed across the vampire man's face. His teeth gritted as he processed the injury. But before Shinwu could capitalize on the moment, the creature retaliated with inhuman strength. Without any visible effort, he swung Shinwu into the air like a rag doll, his grip unrelenting. Shinwoo barely had time to react before he was hurled across the space, his body crashing into a box filled with construction tools. The impact sent a deafening clang throughout the half-built structure, tools scattering across the floor as the force of the collision left him momentarily breathless. Han and Yuna cried out in horror, their voices overlapping in fear and concern. Shinwoo groaned, his body aching from the brutal throw. He pushed himself up, wincing as he gripped his left arm with his right hand, trying to assess the damage. The throbbing pain in his arm was nothing compared to the unsettling realization settling into his mind. His opponent was beyond anything he had ever faced before. As the vampire let out a low, chilling laugh, Shinwoo's thoughts swirled with confusion. How could a person move like that from such a restricted position? It defied all logic, all human limitations. This man, no, this thing, was terrifyingly strong. Yet, despite the evident injury to his arm, the vampire showed no sign of pain, no hesitation, as if his wounds were inconsequential. Shinwoo's gaze fixated on the creature's drooping limb, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. Meanwhile, the two mysterious men overseeing the battle exchanged glances, their expressions shifting from curiosity to intrigue. The scarred man turned to his taller partner, his eyes narrowing as he observed Shinwoo's resilience. The boy was stronger than he had anticipated, showing skill and determination that far exceeded expectations. The taller man smirked, already considering the possibilities. Shinwoo had potential, an untapped well of raw strength and tenacity. He mused aloud, wondering what kind of transformation the boy would undergo if given the right circumstances. His partner did not dismiss the idea, acknowledging that it wasn't an entirely bad thought. However, before they could dwell further on the subject, something else caught their attention. A sudden, overwhelming energy surged through the air, powerful and unrestrained. It wasn't just an ordinary presence, it was a force unlike anything they had encountered before. Both men tensed, their instincts alerting them to the magnitude of the energy radiating nearby. Someone was openly releasing their power without any attempt to conceal it. The sheer intensity of it sent a shiver down their spines. Who could possess such raw, unyielding energy? The taller man's grin widened slightly, amusement flickering in his eyes. If someone was calling for them with this much force, it would be rude not to respond. His companion nodded in agreement, and in a mere instant, they vanished from their spot, disappearing into thin air in a flash, leaving Shinwoo and the vampire behind. Far from the ongoing battle, the two men materialized near the source of the immense energy. Their confident strides faltered as their eyes fell upon the figures standing before them. Their instincts had not deceived them. This presence was indeed overwhelming, suffocating even. The scarred man's smirk wavered as he turned his gaze toward the one responsible for this terrifying display of power. A sense of dread coiled within him as he realized they had walked straight into something far beyond their comprehension. The presence before them was none other than Frankenstein, the chairman, his very being radiating raw fury. His golden eyes burned with intensity, his aura crackling with unrestrained power. He had not simply arrived, he had come with a purpose, and his presence alone sent an unmistakable warning. The scarred man felt a chill crawl up his spine as he instinctively stepped back. Something about this man was different, more dangerous than anything he had encountered before. His instinct screamed at him that he had made a mistake, that they had stepped into the presence of something far beyond their control. His mind raced with thoughts of escape, but before he could react, a voice cut through the tension like a blade. Frankenstein's words were cold, final, leaving no room for argument. The choice was simple: die here or disappear without causing further trouble. The two men stiffened, fully aware that the threat was not an empty one. A flicker of realization crossed their minds. Frankenstein had caught them off guard, appearing from behind without them even sensing his approach. If he had chosen to strike without warning, they wouldn't have stood a chance. Instead, he had given them a choice, an act that felt more like a deliberate warning than mercy. The sheer weight of his presence left them rattled, forcing them to acknowledge the terrifying reality before them. The scarred man swallowed hard, forcing himself to speak despite the fear gripping his chest. His voice came out unsteady as he demanded to know the identity of the man standing before them. But the response he received was even more chilling. Frankenstein's gaze darkened, his expression void of any patience for their questions. In a tone laced with authority, he made it clear they did not deserve to ask such things. The weight of his words sent a shudder through the air, and in that moment, the two men understood. They had underestimated the true danger lurking in the shadows, and now they were face to face with a power they could not hope to challenge. The two men, one bearing a deep scar across his face and the other with a towering build, exchanged a glance, their unspoken understanding evident. The realization struck them both: this battle was turning against them at an alarming rate. In a place like this, they had not expected to encounter two beings capable of exerting such overwhelming pressure. There was no question about it. If this continued, they would undoubtedly lose. The thought alone sent a surge of desperation through them, compelling them to take immediate action. Without hesitation, they launched themselves forward, dashing toward their opponents with a renewed determination, hoping to turn the tide of battle in their favor. The scarred man moved first, extending his clawed hand toward Frankenstein, his sharp nails gleaming under the dim light as he attempted to slash at his opponent with lethal precision. But Frankenstein barely acknowledged the attack, evading the strike with effortless grace. The missed blow only fueled the scarred man's frustration, a low growl escaping his lips as he cursed under his breath. His opponent's composure remained unshaken, an infuriating display of superiority that made the scarred man's blood boil. Meanwhile, his taller companion focused on Rai, gathering every ounce of his immense strength as he clenched his fists tightly. His muscles tensed, veins bulging from the sheer force he was about to unleash. With a furious battle cry, he lunged forward, swinging his fist with devastating power, aiming directly at Rai's face. The force of the punch was enough to send shockwaves through the air, and as his knuckles connected, a deafening impact erupted. The entire area was instantly engulfed in a thick cloud of dust and smoke, the force of the attack shaking the very ground beneath them. For a moment, the scarred man smirked, momentarily believing that the battle had shifted in their favor. He leaped backward, twisting mid-air as he attempted another strike at Frankenstein, slashing wildly in an attempt to land a decisive hit. But just like before, his attacks meant nothing but empty space, each strike dodged with ease. Frustration gnawed at him as he skidded to a stop, assessing the situation. His opponent was strong, but surely, together, the two of them should have been able to overwhelm him. Taking a step back, he cast a glance toward the battlefield, his smirk widening as he taunted Frankenstein. He declared with certainty that his companion had finished off the other opponent. There was no way anyone could survive a direct hit from his partner's monstrous punch. In his mind, the battle was nearly won, and all that remained was eliminating the final obstacle. He turned toward his companion, urging him to finish the job. However, just as the words left his lips, the dust and smoke began to clear, revealing a sight that sent a cold chill down his spine. There, standing amidst the dissipating cloud, was Rai, completely unharmed. His expression remained calm, his piercing red eyes locked onto his adversary. And what was even more terrifying, the massive fist that had been meant to destroy him was now frozen mid-strike, caught effortlessly in Rai's single outstretched hand. The tall man's knuckles trembled against the seemingly unmovable grip, his entire body straining as he realized the sheer power difference between them. The scarred man's breath hitched, his previous confidence evaporating into sheer disbelief. How was this possible? How could anyone stop such an attack so easily? His mind reeled, struggling to comprehend the impossible. Before he could regain his composure, Rai's crimson eyes burned with an otherworldly intensity. A single word escaped his lips, firm, commanding, absolute. Kneel. The effect was instantaneous. The towering man, once so formidable, found himself losing control of his own body. His knees buckled beneath him as an overwhelming force crashed down upon him like an unrelenting tide. His limbs shook violently, his breath coming in ragged gasps as fear took hold of him in its purest form. His body no longer belonged to him. He was trapped under the weight of Rai's command, a mere puppet to his will. The scarred man could only watch in stunned horror as his partner collapsed, completely subdued by a single word. Panic surged through him as he tried to understand what had just occurred. What kind of power was this? How could mere speech render someone so helpless? Before he could process it, a sudden movement caught his attention. His head snapped back toward Frankenstein, only to find the man now standing ominously close, his golden gaze filled with amusement and condescension. "Where are you looking?" The words sent a sharp chill through the scarred man's spine. But before he could react, a searing pain tore through his arms. A sharp, glowing force sliced cleanly through his limbs, purple energy crackling like an unrelenting storm. Blood spattered onto the ground as he stumbled backward, clutching his wounded arms in agony. Frankenstein stood over him, his expression unchanging, his presence utterly domineering. The sheer precision of the attack left no doubt. His opponent had been toying with him all along. Humiliation burned within the scarred man as he grit his teeth, trembling from the pain. This was unlike any battle he had ever fought. These men, these monsters, were beyond anything he and his partner had anticipated. His thoughts raced as he struggled to keep himself steady, but the harsh truth was undeniable. They were outmatched. Meanwhile, the tall man remained kneeling, his mind spiraling with fear and disbelief. How could this be happening? How had he lost control of his own body with nothing more than a single command? A creeping dread settled deep within him as his eyes flickered toward Rai, who stood above him, his expression unreadable but radiating with barely contained fury. Where had these men come from? And more importantly, what were they? The scarred man stood frozen, his breath ragged, as blood dripped steadily from the deep gashes in his arms. His body ached, his pride lay in shambles, and yet his mind reeled with an even greater weight, disbelief. Where had these powerful figures been hiding all this time? How could beings of such overwhelming strength exist, remaining unseen until now? He clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms as he tried to make sense of the impossible. And then there was the one they called Rai. Recognition dawned on him as he recalled seeing the mysterious figure before, walking among the children, blending in as if he were nothing more than one of them. Shinwoo, Ikhan, Yuna. Those ordinary kids had been in his presence, completely unaware of the monstrous power that lurked beneath the surface. The scarred man felt a shudder crawl down his spine. If only they had known. His thoughts were violently interrupted as Frankenstein raised his hand, his intent clear. This was it, the final moment, the finishing blow. The scarred man's breath caught in his throat as he braced himself, his mind screaming in defiance, yet his body refusing to move. Was this really the end? Had they fought only to be struck down so easily? He squeezed his eyes shut, as if in resignation, expecting the inevitable pain that would follow. But then, a voice cut through the tension like a blade. A simple, commanding order. Stop. The weight of that single word alone sent a ripple through the air, carrying such authority that even Frankenstein hesitated. Without question, Rai had made his decision, his calm demeanor unshaken as he turned away from their defeated opponents. His pace was slow, deliberate, as he walked toward the exit, not sparing them another glance. Frankenstein, though momentarily confused, understood one thing: his master's orders were absolute. There was no need for explanations. If Rai had chosen to spare them, there was a reason. Whatever it was, Frankenstein did not question it. He lowered his hand, withholding the finishing blow, and instead followed his master's lead. Yet, as they walked past their fallen enemies, Frankenstein paused for a brief moment, his gaze settling on the scarred man, who remained tense, his body rigid with uncertainty. The butler's voice, though calm, carried an undeniable threat. The choice had been made, but it was not a choice given out of kindness. It was a warning. The scarred man, still shaken, barely managed to muster a response, his voice filled with reluctant acceptance. He understood the meaning behind those words. They were being allowed to leave, but it was not out of mercy. It was a reminder. At any moment, their lives could be taken if they made the wrong move. Yet, something about it felt surreal. He couldn't comprehend why beings of such strength would simply let them go without demanding anything in return. It made no sense. Caution edged his voice as he voiced his doubt, struggling to believe that their lives had been spared so easily. He wanted an answer, something to justify the situation, but the response he received only sent a fresh wave of dread coursing through him. Frankenstein turned slightly, his golden eyes gleaming with an almost amused indifference. There was no need for elaborate explanations. His aura flared to life, raw power radiating off him like an invisible storm, suffocating in its intensity. If they truly wished to test their luck again, they were welcome to try. The scarred man and his towering partner stiffened, their bodies instinctively reacting to the sheer force pressing down on them. A cold sweat formed on their brows as their limbs trembled, not from exhaustion, but from pure, unfiltered fear. There would be no second chances. If they crossed the line again, their lives would be forfeit. No warnings, no hesitation. Rai and Frankenstein continued walking, their presence lingering like an unshakable shadow even as they disappeared into the distance. The two defeated men stood in silence, their bodies heavy with the weight of what had just transpired. Even as they remained alive, they understood they had been utterly, hopelessly outclassed. Outside, as they walked through the cool night air, Rai suddenly came to a halt. Without warning, he raised a hand to his forehead, his fingers pressing against his temple. A sudden dizziness swept over him, and his balance faltered. Frankenstein's sharp senses immediately picked up on the shift. He was at Rai's side in an instant, steadying him with a firm yet gentle grip. Concern flickered in his usually composed expression as he studied his master closely. The long slumber had clearly taken its toll on him. "Master, are you all right?" Frankenstein's voice carried an urgency that he rarely showed. It was as he had feared. Rai's prolonged sleep had weakened him in ways that could not be ignored. His body had yet to fully adjust to being awake, and the strain of exerting so much energy had left him vulnerable. But just as Frankenstein prepared to suggest resting, Rai finally spoke, though his voice was quiet, almost distracted. The words that followed, however, were not what Frankenstein had expected. Buttons. Frankenstein blinked in confusion. For a moment, he hesitated, as if certain he had misheard. Buttons. The word felt oddly out of place in a situation like this. His gaze followed Rai's movements as his master looked down at his coat, fingers brushing over the undone buttons of his suit. Realization struck, and Frankenstein nearly let out a breath of disbelief. Rai wasn't concerned about his condition. He wasn't worried about the battle or the enemies they had just defeated. No, what had truly unsettled him, what had caused him to pause, was the simple fact that his coat had come undone. Frankenstein watched as Rai swiftly refastened each button with a practiced, precise movement, his expression unreadable yet clearly displeased at the disorder. A small chuckle nearly escaped Frankenstein's lips, but he quickly suppressed it, blinking away the sudden moisture in his eyes. It was a ridiculous, almost absurd contrast. The terrifying, all-powerful Lord of Nobles, whose mere presence had forced two formidable enemies to tremble in fear, was deeply troubled by the untidiness of his own clothing. The battle had been brutal, their enemies had been crushed without effort, and yet, what truly unsettled his master was the state of his suit. Frankenstein exhaled softly, his lips curving into a rare, affectionate smile. Some things never changed.